for us, for anyone to watch later. And we will start out with the bracha for Torah study, which is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher ktanu
Amen.
And let's see. Do we where we're at? I feel like we just dive right in. There's no other that needs to be done. We're on chapter 6 of the book of Daniel, right? So chapter 6 of the book of Daniel. Now, each chapter up to this point sort of like deals with some sort of miraculous event in the going on with Daniel or with his friends and companions in the in exile in Babylon, right? Like, so if the time setting of the stories is after the destruction of the first temple, the exile of the Judean leadership to Babylon, that's when it's taking place. And as we mentioned, it likely is being written some centuries later during Maccabean times. But each chapter deals with some miraculous event in Daniel's life. Chapter 6 is one of those signature events. Chapter 5 was Daniel being the only advisor able to read the writing on the wall, which again apparently was not legible to anyone else, but was not only legible to Daniel, but he knew what it meant, that the king would be overthrown and his territory sort of parceled out. Doesn't map onto historical reality, but again, it's not entirely clear that that's a desire. It's not necessarily that genre of literature where it's supposed to map onto historical reality. So that's more or less where chapter 6 starts out. Belshazzar, the previous king, again in reality just a regent, but king, he is killed. His kingdom is parceled out, and Darius the Mede is the one who we focus on as the new king, the new real ruler of the territory. Before we go into detail on Darius the Mede, like the JPS note on this is that the reference to Darius the Mede is unhistorical. Darius was a famous Persian king from 522 to 486 BCE, responsible for organizing his empire into provinces headed by satraps or governors. According to Herodotus, its histories, Darius established 20 satrapies, contrast the exaggerated tradition of Esther. And Esther, the king, is ahead of 127 provinces. Here he says that the reality was 20. The four empires schema requires media be represented, and this is possibly a story originally involving Darius of Persia that's been altered to fit the way the story is being told. With that, question about where we start out. Last week we got the writing on the wall. This week we'll see what happens to Daniel. And this sort of like this chapter will mark the end of one of the first part of the book. After this, the sort of mood of the book changes. Chapter 6. It pleased Darius to raise up 120 satraps to be throughout his kingdom, and then above them 3 overseers of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps would report that the king should not be troubled. Right? So it starts out saying, we're following the story of Daniel, but so the new king has all of these territories, 3 people to oversee the territories. They report to the king. Daniel's one of that highest echelon of individuals. So he's gone up more or less as far as he can on the organizational flowchart. You know, he's just below the king. Again, echoes of the Joseph story, or of Mordecai. Verse 4. Then Then was this Daniel preeminent among the overseers and the satraps, for there is exceptional spirit in him. The king thought to raise him up over the whole kingdom. Again, similar language to the Joseph story, and one can only imagine that this, the implication is that we'll see, is that his foreignness brings up a sense of jealousy and resentment. So now the number 2 man is a foreigner, somebody of a different ethnicity and different religion, and that brings trouble for Daniel because other people don't like that. Back then, apparently, people got upset if you with this sort of situation. If you were a different ethnicity or a different religion, people would that the native population or the majority population could be upset by such a group being in charge. So our world, of course, if you look across our nation, across the globe, we've solved that problem. But in ancient times, it was different. Anyway, what can you say? So Daniel is not only, first he's put into the top 3, then he's like the top 1. Verse 5, then the overlords and the satraps were seeking to find some pretext against Daniel in regard to the kingdom, but no pretext, no corruption could they find, for he was faithful, and no fault or corruption was found in him, right? Like, so everyone else upset that the minority religious group, so the equivalent in the US, like for some people, it would be Jews, right? Like people get upset, like there's a certain sort of bigoted element that's upset when Jews are overrepresented in the government. For others, it could be Muslims, right? Like if Muslims are overrepresented. For some, it could be it could be evangelical Christians. So at one point in time, it was Catholics, right? Like so whatever. Like there's always a minority religious group that people don't like, and the same is true for ethnicities. What are we doing with some foreigner ruling over us? But Daniel is clean. They can't find, they're gunning for him, but he's too clean. They can't find anything to nail him on. So when you can find something to nail somebody on because they're too clean, you of course set a trap for them that they can't help but step into. That the very cleanliness will make them step into. Verse 6. Then these men said that no pretext was found against this Daniel. We have found one against him in the law of his God. This is a classic sort of like anti-Semitic ploy and classic idea that that you find across the history of anti-Semitism, right? Is the sure, his personal character is unimpeachable, but these Jews have these rules that make them different and thus dangerous. This is, of course, what Haman, who says vis-a-vis Mordechai, right? There's a certain people whose laws are not like our laws, and their practices, they're not like our practices, right? Like they're different and therefore bad. And that, of course, we're all familiar with. We see another echo of it here. The advisors, the king's advisors in the book of Daniel are like, yeah, he might seem fine, but the Jews, their rules make them essentially disloyal to us. Verse 7. Then did these overseers and satraps come in a crowd to the king and thus said to him, King Darius, live forever. Long live the king. Verse 8. All the overseers of the kingdom, the governors and the satraps and the counselors have resolved to issue a royal vow and enforce a binding edict that for 30 days, whoever asks a petition of any god or man other than you, O king, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, O king, you should issue the binding edict and put it down in writing that is not to be changed, according to the laws of Media and Persia, that shall not be transgressed. Aha! Here we have our pretext, right? Anyone who worships a god or a king other than you, O great king, that person is disloyal and should be thrown into the lion's den. This is their pretext to entrap Daniel into breaking the law. Now, as with the stories of the Persian Empire in the Book of Esther, this feels like a story. It doesn't feel like it's supposed to be realistic. Meaning, Jews weren't the only religious minority. Like, other people would have worshipped their gods too, right? It sort of like makes sense if anyone swears a loyalty oath to any king other than you, O king, any human king, then all right, that sort of feels like treason. But this whole like or God is sort of, it feels ahistorical. As Alter notes, Darius never claimed divinity for himself. This isn't like Pharaoh or other kings through history that have seen themselves as a god king. So you never would have like made that. It's unlikely that would have been a reasonable decree to make. And then like the sort of like edict put down in writing that is not to be changed feels again like an echo of the Book of Esther and some of the unrealistic elements of the Book of Esther, right? If Esther is if it's ridiculous to have laws that you can't change. That doesn't that's not the way societies functions. Is you always have to be able to change laws to different circumstances. That just feels that has a whiff of unreality about it, but makes for a good fairy tale, as it were, makes for a good story to create a world where once a decree is issued, nobody can talk you out of it. This is the way it is. I'll pause there. Thoughts? Again, so the decree, the whole scene feels somewhat similar to the Book of Esther, A, and B, it feels similar to sort of like patterns throughout history of Jews being the focus of jealousy and anger, and the searching for a pretext in the sort of nature of Jewishness in order to try and harm whatever sort of Jewish social climber you're looking to stop.
Rabbi?
Yep.
Rabbi, doesn't it indicate here too that the king goes along with whatever these appointed people of the court are asking of him? He doesn't seem to have an opinion that they could have a different king.
Yeah, he's like the king. Everybody in Daniel like is sort of feels like a stock character. Unlike at least when Ahasuerus sort of like took advice, like you sort of like the way this guy did, it was part of his personality. Like he had something of a developed personality where it's like, oh, like this is the kind of guy who likes wine, women, and song, and he listens to the last guy who whispered in his ear. These characters throughout Daniel are really stock characters. So yes, you are right. And it's just sort of like it's just the way this guy feels drawn. Yes, he doesn't, but he just follows orders. So you can see where this is all going. Verse 11. Because of this, King Darius indicted the writ of the binding decree. Right, the king, Muriel's point, just signs off. And when Daniel knew that the writ was indicted, he went into his house and had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. And 3 times daily he would fall to his knees and pray and give thanks before his God, just as he had done in time past. Now, here, in what is a rare move for the Tanakh, we hear an echo of actual later Jewish practice. One, Daniel, unlike most other people we've met along the way, davens, if I can use an anachronistic word. He's davening. And not only is he davening, but he's davening 3 times a day. And not only is he davening 3 times a day, but he's davening 3 times a day facing Jerusalem because he's in exile. So we have, like, again, David, King Solomon, Moses, all these guys, they may have said prayers every so often. Every so often they say, please God, blah, 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 blah. But there's never an indication of a prayer routine or of fixed prayers or of a schedule or anything like that. Every time a prominent biblical character prays, Joshua, Esther, in addition to the people above, right? Like they do so spontaneously in the moment and seemingly with their own words. Now, the Levites in the temple presumably were singing psalms, and if you're going to sing a psalm or a song, like, you know, any choir has to know the words, right? Like, you have to have a rehearsal. Like, so presumably there's something fixed there and according to a fixed schedule. But this sort of outside of the Beit HaMikdash, an individual praying, and the main thing is prayer. Of course, the Levites in the temple are accompaniment. The main thing is the sacrifice. The sideshow is the Levites singing. Here, Daniel's connection with God is driven, it would seem, or a key component of it, it would seem, is the fact that he davens 3 times a day facing Jerusalem. And obviously, that he does this, we can surmise, is known. How do we know it's known? Because why else would these guys come up with this as a way to entrap him? So fascinating. Now, is this original to the time? Is this something that they put in back there? Is it something retrojected to him? Is this the beginning of the tradition, or just a one-off? Daniel did this and we happen also to do it hundreds of years later? There's no way of knowing. You could read it either way. But Daniel's praying 3 times a day and facing Jerusalem, both of which obviously are Jewish practices in the present day. You notice that he's not standing, as it were. We associate Jewish prayer with standing, or at least being told to please rise and please be seated by by some rabbi. He's falling to his knees. Like, this is not like what we consider like a typical Jewish pose, though bowing certainly would have, obviously is a key part of Jewish prayer, and being on your knees in the temple would have been more common. There's nothing sort of essential about it. Like, even if Jews picture, like modern day Jews may picture praying on your knees to be something associated with Catholicism or with Islam, there's nothing essential about that. Jews at different points in history have prayed on their knees, and it, by the way, is a powerful thing to be on your knees and to pray. It is a sense of supplication. So, great line and significant line again for us who know of these things. So again, verse 11, when Daniel knew that the writ was indicted, he went to his house and had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem, and 3 times daily he would fall to his knees and pray and give thanks before his God, just as he had done in time past. Then these men come in a crowd and find Daniel petitioning and imploring his God, right? So like they if you're good at entrapping somebody, both like you sort of, have the law passed, and then at the time when you know a person's going to be violating it, you go ambush him. Verse 13. Then they approached and said before the king, about the binding edict, O king. Not indicted a binding edict that any man who petitioned any god or man for 30 days other than you, O king, should be thrown into the lion's den. So again, all you gotta do is remind him of it. Alter notes part of the unreality of the whole situation is that is the 30 days. If it's disloyal to worship anyone other than the king, then why cap it at 30 days? That should be always. There's nothing, if it's not okay to do, it's not okay to do in 5 weeks. Like it's not. So clearly it's sort of like, it's just like an obvious setup where like they sort of like ask other people to pause their religion for a month, and then you can go back as you were. We just need to entrap this guy. But also it doesn't feel realistic, because the king, even if he's sort of like an empty head king, would be like, well, why 30 days? Why not always? Back half of verse 13, the king answered and said, the word is right according to the law of Media and Persia, which cannot be transgressed. 14, again, sort of like feel echoes of Esther. 14, then do they answer and say before the king that Daniel, who is of the exiles of Judah, has paid no heed to you, O king, nor to the binding edict that you indicted, and that 3 times daily he makes his petition. Then when the king heard the word, it was very dire for him, and he set out his mind on Daniel to save him, until sunset he was striving to rescue him. Right? So the king now realizes, I don't know if he realizes he's been had, but he realizes that he's in a corner. Daniel's in a corner, of course, because he's going to throw into the lion's den, but the king doesn't want to do it either. This king, unlike the earlier kings, gets that Daniel is the best man for the job. He doesn't want anything bad to happen to him, and didn't know enough, or didn't foresee, or just again like blindly signed off on the edict. That he's all wrought up that Daniel is now guilty. He doesn't want to hurt Daniel. Daniel is a helpful guy to have around. But he's been outsmarted by his advisors. 16. Then these men came in a crowd to the king and said to the king, know, O king, that it is a rule of Media and Persia that any binding edict or vow that the king issues cannot be changed. Right, again, echoes of Esther. Again, note that the only reason they would say this is if they think the king is wavering. The fact that the king stayed up, it says, all night, essentially. The king's up late trying to figure out how to save Daniel. So everyone else sees this going on. And the advisors come in trying to put a stop to the king's efforts to save Daniel. Remember, there's no way out. 17, then the king said, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. Right? The king realizes there's no way out of it. So they throw down Daniel in the lion's den. The king spoke out and said to Daniel, your God, whom you always worship, will save you. So that may be a sincere prayer on the part of the king. Maybe not. Maybe yes. Presumably, again, the king seems to be on Daniel's side, but feels limited legally by what he can do. 18. By the way, that also, if part of the Book of Esther is mocking the Persians for the idea of sort of like making a god out of their laws, making laws that you can't change, the same is true here. There's an implicit critique of you, even already, like to use the modern phrase for it, you can't say just following orders, right? Just as Ahasuerus is something of an idiot for saying, well, once it's a law, what can you do? The Jews have to be able to be killed. And the same thing here, I don't want to kill Daniel, but what can you do? A law is a law. that sort of attitude is implicitly mocked as unwise.
But could you say when the king says, "May your guard whom you serve regularly save you," couldn't that be considered an entreatment by the king to a different god other than him? Therefore, he should also join Daniel in the lion's den.
I think by definition, kings are above the law. Though he doesn't pray to him,
Yeah.
he doesn't beseech him, he just says, "Oh, your God will bail you out," right? And I mean, if anything, you'd think it'd be a way to say that he's assuaging his own conscience. I'm sending you in the lion's den, but we know that your God can work miracles, so your blood isn't on my hands. God's the one. God can save you, and so if God doesn't save you, not on me. Again, not a good theology to have now, obviously, but it's presumably the theology of the book.
Rabbi, you don't get the feeling that the king really believes it, because in the next couple of lines, he's fasting and he's sleepless and he's worried. So maybe it was just a throwaway line, "Your God's going to help you."
Right, and that's that could be the case. That's just that he's just saying it, or it could just be like what you say to condemned prisoners. May God have mercy on your soul. Right? Like, yeah, like I don't know, like in movies, certainly that's sort of like what they say. So yeah. Yeah, it might not be sincere. 18. And a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his signet and with the signet of his nobles, that nothing should be changed regarding Daniel. Right. So I presume like as Alter notes, like putting the signet on the stone means this is here and you can't move it away on pain of violating the king's decree. Right. Nobody I don't know like what the setting is, because it seems that it's it could be like some sort of cave or something like this, right? That they're or some sort of dungeon that they've tossed him into, or that he's in. And in this dungeon is lions. Hungry.
This story is told in such a simplistic way. It's almost like it's a children's, Bible study, Sunday school class chapter of Sunday, session. Because
yes, go on.
No, I was going to say, because the king is obviously, he's very egotistic, and he's also not terribly bright. He's happy to throw any of his enemies into the lion's den. But he should have known, and apparently he did know, that Daniel was a devout Jew. So he was very easily duped. So, so much of it is too hard to swallow. It's almost like just a simple little story to prove, the power of God and being devoted to God over any person or anything. And that's the lesson of the story, but there's like no substance to it.
I sort of agree. And to me, almost the whole book is this way. And this might be why, like we're studying Daniel, but like nobody studies Daniel. We all know writing on the wall lines, but like nothing more than that. So yes, I agree. And it is, and it's not, I don't know, again, the other characters that we've met along the way were sort of so like deep and rich. Like like plotting Shavuot with Rabbi Gluck. He's like, I want to teach, we should teach around the theme of such and such, outsiderness and Ruth. I'm like, oh, I can't wait. I love Ruth. I love Naomi. They're people in my life. And Esther and Mordecai, again, like they're people in my life. Same is true for Moshe and David, and like characters like that. They're so well developed, and they have conflicts, and they have like the whole thing that we talked about. Like just even like Ruth, like they feel so human. These are stock characters, right? In movies, they're always stock characters that you just know. Oh, here's the tough sergeant. Like I don't need I don't need to know much about it. I just like, tough sergeant down at the station at the station house. Here's the they're just stock characters that you always run into. The frat boy, the wise, the smart scientist, the dumb good-looking person, like whatever it might be. Like they're all these stock characters, and all these guys in Daniel feel like stock characters. Even Daniel is sort of like blindly pious. Like he's not. Moses struggles to be Moses, to do the right thing. And he's always sort of like snipping at God or losing patience with the people. And you feel him barely holding it together. Daniel is just like perfect. There's no character. So yes, and then so all of this, and the king, like again, Ahasuerus at least like felt like a character as much as Muriel. This guy doesn't. They're just stuck. So I don't think it's that great. And by the way, the reason that this one reason which that might be significant is that there is a school of thought that says that the earlier biblical books are more primitive and the later ones are more developed philosophically and emotionally and morally. So if Leviticus has you doing sacrifices, Deuteronomy later on says, love God with all your heart. And instead of offering primitive sacrifice, you love God with all your heart. And that's a higher level and a more civilized level. And that you sort of keep going closer and closer. And then it culminates then that line of thinking then says, by definition, the New Testament is superior to the Old because it reflects this later, more developed level of thought and not the earlier primitive level of thought. Daniel, of course, is probably the latest biblical book to be written in the Tanakh. And I want to highlight that for this point, and that we can read it and sort of see clearly, like, wait a minute, this isn't at a higher level. In fact, it feels less literary and deep than these clearly earlier books. History doesn't work that way. History isn't always an upward slope, as we well know, like it goes up and down. So for us, we can say that an earlier biblical book, like the stories in the book of Samuel, are much older than the book of Daniel, but richer and more developed than Daniel, which is sort of wooden. So I bring that in as an argument, like whenever you hear somebody say the Jewish thoughts just sort of kept getting more developed over time. And then again, like part of the implicit claim there is that it culminates later with this offshoot Jewish sect that would become Christianity. People can believe that. Again, Baruch Hashem, I got no problem with people being Christian, whatever it might be. That's great. But I don't think that approach holds up. Daniel's proof of that. That's part of what I think when I read this story. The verse 19. Here we see the king's feeling bad for what he's done. Then did the king go to his palace and fast through the night, and no banquet table was set before him, and he slept, and his sleep went wandering from him. Same as Alter notes, this is the vivid literal sense of Aramaic and the Hebrew idiom for insomnia. The same is true for Ahasuerus and Esther. Ahasuerus and Esther, when he gets up in the middle of the night and needs the book of Chronicles read to him, and he discovers Mordecai saved him, etc. Like his sleep wandered from him. Great idiom. Especially if you're ever lying awake at night and you like feel like it, like your sleep is supposed to be there, but it's somehow wandered away. Like it's a
iMac.
Right, you might be able to identify with. But the king clearly feels bad. Then did the king rise with the light at dawn, and in a rush went to the lion's den. And as he approached the den, he shouted to Daniel with a sad voice. The king spoke out and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, your God, whom you worship always, can he have saved you from the lions? Now, notice the king, despite his signing off on the decree and like following the rules, is portrayed somewhat sympathetically. He stayed up all night trying to figure out a way to save Daniel, couldn't sleep after having condemned Daniel, wakes up at dawn to assuming that Daniel's dead. The altar's note there is the king is sorely afraid that Daniel has been torn to shreds. And so he shouts to Daniel as he comes near, hoping against hope that he will get a response. If not, he may choose not to have the stone rolled back. Verse 22, then did Daniel speak with the king, O king, live forever. There's a loyal subject for you. My God sent his messenger, and he shut the lions' mouths, and they did not harm me, because I was found innocent before him, and also before you, O king. No harm have I done. Messenger, of course, malach, is the Hebrew word for angel. It means messenger, means angel. It's the same word in Hebrew. So you can translate however you like. Daniel survives the night with a hungry lion, miraculously. Altar notes, I think helpfully, efforts to explain this naturalistically. For example, the king may have had the lions fed before Daniel was thrown into the den are dubious. As with the 10 plagues in Exodus, the writer manifestly wants to present this event as a miracle enabled by an emissary sent by God. So again, same in each case. Like, there are always people saying, well, the plagues really could have been this, could be explained this way scientifically. Sort of not the point of the biblical narrative. The biblical narrative wants you to believe this happened miraculously. So you can't say the king surreptitiously quick threw in a few stakes before rolling the stone over. The author doesn't want you to think that. The author wants you to think this was a miracle. God interferes and helps those loyal to God. Also, as Daniel sort of underlines, like, worshiping God says nothing bad about you, king. King, I'm loyal. It's just, this is I just have this God as well. 24, then the king was very content, and he said to bring up Daniel from the den. And Daniel was brought up from the den. Again, of course, it doesn't say you have to kill him in the lion's den. It just says you have to throw him in the lion's den. So he did it. He complied with the decree. There's no problem in bringing him up. And Daniel was brought up from the den, and no harm was found in him, for he had trusted in his God. And the king said, and they brought those men who had slandered Daniel, and they threw them into the lion's den, them and their children and their wives. They had barely touched the bottom of the den when the lions overwhelmed them and crunched all their bones. Trigger warning. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and tongues that dwelled in all the land, great peace to you. By me an edict has been issued that in all the realm of my kingdom, people shall fear and tremble before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and endures forever, and his kingdom shall not be destroyed in his dominion until the end. He saves and rescues and does signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth, who has saved Daniel from the lions. And this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Why the wives and kids? Are we going back to the first book we read, killing everybody in sight? What's going on?
Well, that's what we got here. So so Alter's note on this is his mind goes the same place yours does. The retribution, as in the story of Achan's violation of the ban in Joshua chapter 7, is swift and savage. Not only are the scheming counselors fed to the lions, but so are their entire families. This, on some level, it's troubling. less troubling, as it were, than when it happened in the book of Joshua, because in Joshua, it's an Israelite, and the Israelite God that commands it. Here, Darius is doing it like out of zeal for God, as it were, but he's doing it on his own, right? You know, there's no this is what's troubling in the other version in Joshua is God saying, wipe them out. A Gentile king wiping them out, it's a bad thing, but like it's sort of like less morally troubling. Like so that, but
And maybe this will teach him a lesson, you know?
But well, that seems to be it. Though there's no, though I don't want to like go too far with that. There's no question that the book here and the Tanakh then as is it's sealing it with its signet ring, as it were, meaning that there's no sense here that it's the wrong thing to do, or that Darius overstepped himself by doing it, or Daniel was like, no. Like there's no there's no sense that he's doing the wrong thing. It's just this is what he's doing. Let me see what they the Jewish Study Dial's comment is the importance of family identity in the ancient Near East could result in family members receiving the punishment of the male heads of household. Per book number 16, Samuel 20, 2 Samuel 21, Esther, obviously all of Haman's family gets killed, right? And contradistinction to that, they give 2 citations from Jeremiah and from Ezekiel. You'll find both, which is to say, occasionally you'll find the family punished for the actions of, again, usually the male head of household, and occasionally not. But our sense of individualism is very much, it's not entirely a modern construct, but it's not, but is not as strongly felt, not only in the biblical period, but in other societies, right? Like people very much like sort of as we've seen, like the Israelites are rewarded and punished as a group. And so we said, like your left hand might be punished for something that your right hand does. And we understand that. My brain makes a decision and my left hand gets punished for it because it touches the burner or whatever it is. That's closer to how at different times over the course of history, both the Tanakh and the Jewish tradition have seen people. To this day, the president makes a decision and somebody else may suffer for it, and we sort of like get that that's the way things work. That's how, even for God's world, as it were, that's part of how it works. The children and wives are extensions of the male head of household.
Rabbi, in Alter's note, he says that the retribution, as in the story of Achan's violation of the ban in Judges, what does that refer to?
Let's zap back through the mists of time. That's actually, if I can do specific, that's one of the things that Norm sort of was referencing. The book of Joshua has stuff like this. So when Joshua conquers Jericho, there's the famous scene in Joshua chapter 6. Joshua, son of Nun, summoned the priests and said to them, take up the Ark of the Covenant, let 7 priests carry 7 ram's horns, precede the Ark of the Lord. And he tells the people, go march around the city 7 times, blowing the shofar. And the walls will come down. And then it says on the seventh day, they march around the city in the same manner 7 times. There's only, on the 7th round, the priests blew the horns. Joshua commanded the people, shout, the Lord has given you the city. And they shout, and then he says, the city and everything in it are to be proscribed, meaning destroyed. I'm reading Joshua 6, verse 17. City of Jericho, everything in it shall be proscribed for the Lord. Only Rahab, the harlot, is to be spared, and all who are within her house, because she hid the messengers we sent. But you must beware of that which is proscribed, i.e., to be destroyed, or else you will be proscribed. If you take anything from that which is prescribed, you will cause the camp of Israel to be proscribed. You will bring calamity. All the silver and gold and objects of copper and iron are consecrated to the Lord. They must go into the treasury of the Lord. Right? So metal is going to be melted down and used in the sanctuary. Items have to be destroyed. You go to the ram's horn, walls come tumbling down. Rahab escapes. Verse 24, they burned down the city and everything in it, but the silver and gold and objects of copper and iron were deposited in the treasury of the house. Only Rahab survived. At that time, Joshua pronounced this oath: "Cursed of the Lord shall be the man who shall undertake to fortify this city of Jericho. He shall lay its foundation at the cost of his firstborn and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest." Chapter 7. The Israelites, however, violated the prescription. Achan, son of Carmi, son of Zabi, son of Zerach, of the tribe of Judah, took that which was prescribed. The Lord was incensed with the Israelites. So he violates the ban, violates the rule of don't take anything. And then where are we going? Let me fast forward to the key piece here. Early next morning, Joshua and Israel come forward by tribes. The tribe of Judah came forward. Joshua said to Achan, who was guilty, "My son, pay honor to the Lord God of Israel, and make confession to him. Tell me what you have done. Do not hold anything back from me." Achan answered Joshua, "It is true, I have sinned against the Lord God of Israel. This is what I did. I saw among the spoil a fine Shinar mantle, 250 shekels of silver, a wedge of gold, and I coveted them and took them. They were buried in the ground near my tent with the silver under it. Joshua sent messengers who hurried to the tent. It was buried in his tent, took it back, Then Joshua and all Israel with him took Achan, son of Zerah, and the silver and the mantle and the wedge of gold, his sons and daughters, and his ox, and his donkey, and his flock, and his tent, and all his belongings, and brought them up to the valley of Achor. And Joshua said, "What calamity you have brought upon us! The Lord will bring calamity upon you this day." And all Israel pelted him with stones. They put them to the fire and stoned them, i.e., his whole family. They raised a huge mound of stones over him, which is still there. Then the anger of the Lord subsided. That is why they named the valley of Achor, as is still the case. So the entire family there is burned. For the deeds of the male head of household. Conceivably, in this story, you could say that the family knew what was going on because it was buried beneath. Now, of course, we today would say, but they still don't have agency, right? Like the wife or the child can't go to Joshua and say, "Dad just stole this stuff." Like they would be believed. They don't have agency, and nobody wants them to do it. But the male head of household represents the whole family. So what he benefits from, they benefit from, and what he's guilty of, they're guilty of.
Thank you.
At least there were no animals in this one.
At least there are no animals.
If you remember, right? In the book of Joshua, it was the animals too.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Here is their family. So I don't know. So again, is this I mean, look, Lahavdil is not the same thing. It's Israel certainly doesn't has a long-standing policy of tearing down houses of terrorists. If the PA famously gives payouts to the terrorists, like, so there's a sense of to the families of slain or imprisoned terrorists. Like, so you have this thing going on of, presumably it's meant as a deterrent, because part of your point in life is for your progeny to survive you'll be discouraged from violating God's rules if you know that they will suffer as well. Is that fair? Is that not fair? They just don't have the same sense of individuality. Like, it's a unit, family unit.
Rabbi, how about this chapter as an allegory for the Jews living in diaspora, with Daniel as the Jews, throwing into the lion's den as the possibility of being destroyed as a people by assimilating, and the retribution being maintaining your relationship to God?
So yes, and like sort of even more, if most historians believe that this is written during Maccabean times. So I would sort of like underline, like, yes, though the diaspora is sort of like, given that context, it's diaspora or at home. If this is being written, in fact, during the time of Antiochus, and the decrees against abandoning God, or to abandon God, and that you can be killed for circumcising your children, or for keeping Shabbat, or for teaching Torah, or whatever, or offering sacrifice, whatever it might be. This story is absolutely an allegory, saying in diaspora or in the land of Israel, when it's being ruled by the kind of people like this, they keep the faith. God will save you. God will work a miracle to save you, but it depends upon you keeping the faith. Even if you're being thrown into the lion's den, don't despair. God's going to bail you out of it. And you know it's going to happen to the people who are plotting your death and who are betraying God. They're the ones that are going to get it. The tables will be turned. So yes, it's good for the diaspora, but if it's being written in Maccabean times, it's good for the land of Israel as well. But it definitely historically functions both ways, which is to say, for the Maccabees and also for Jews in the diaspora, it's a source of strength to keep the faith, as it were. And obviously, it's functioned that way in Christian circles as well. Christians know this story as well as Jews do, or better. And sort of like the Roman persecutions of Christians and throwing Christians in the lions have only sort of increased the importance of this story of keep the faith. Even when things look bad, God will bail you out. So yes. The whole ending then of chapter 11 is a little fantastic. It's not just like getting rid of the families, though, again, morally problematic. It's the as has happened in a couple of these chapters, the king suddenly becomes like a full convert, and like everyone should worship the God of Israel because that's the one true God who it rules the whole world and forever and ever and all this stuff. It's sort of this wish fulfillment that of a wonderful ending for the king recognizes that God is God. And then Daniel, of course, prospers in the end, and the author's note on that one. The reign of Darius and into the reign of Cyrus the Persian. The order of the two emperors suggests that Cyrus came after Darius, though in point of historical fact, Cyrus preceded him. The reason for this reversal is that the writer wants to preserve the paradigm of the four kingdoms. Darius is supposedly to be a Mede, which is why Cyrus is then identified as the Persian, right? Like sort of the order of empires that will rule the territory. So yes, and that is that's the Lion's Den. Like again, last week, Right in the World, this week, Lion's Den. These are the famous stories. The JPS's comment for verse 27 is that that last oh wait, sorry, my mistake. I picked the wrong one. Yeah, so it is a useful piece, right? We'll pick up next time. 7 and forward have a different feel than the ones before this. It becomes a little less third person-y. We may end up having to skip, but God willing, we'll be able to do this again next week. Till then.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.